Are you sure you want to start live streaming? Yes. And we're starting. And we are live. Welcome to Digital Renegade Podcast. I am your host, the Dashing Rogue, and I'm with my frequent sidekick, Artistic Layman.
How do you do, fellow kids?
And I'm with Freedom Alternative Research and Analysis. How are you
Hello.
doing?
I'm doing fine, especially now since it's a bit of an afternoon on my end. You're probably doing slightly worse than me since it's midnight on your end.
Yeah, man.
I apologize that you have to stay so up late in night to talk to me.
Don't worry about it, man. It's all good. It's all good. But yeah, I mean, honestly, I think it's I guess we just start. I'm kind of drifted here because it is early morning, and I pulled an all nighter. But yeah, we're going to be talking a bit more in depth about the whole Duginist thing, more about Alexander Gierovich Dugin. Is that how you pronounce the
Yes.
man's name?
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to know, I guess, just for a recap for those who may never seen any of your work or any of my work on the man, can you tell me a bit about Alexander Dugin? Real quick,
Right. Alexander Galievich Dugin is, a radical and has been a radical since he had his political awakening about 35-ish years ago, probably a bit less than that. But he started becoming relevant sometime during late Boris Yeltsin's presidency when he created something called the National Bolshevik Party in the modern Russia, in the Russian Federation, and it was just as bad as it sounds. So, but the faction that really matters is what came after the National Bolshevik Party, because the party itself did not have much of a political success, but in 1997 and especially 1999, when Putin's full ascension to power occurred, a bit after the Chechen War, a portion of his party wanted to support Putin as a pragmatic ways of getting some of his ideas into the mainstream, whilst another faction wanted to stick with, well, it sounds cliche, but it was really a Nazi Bolshevik party, because that's what they wanted to stick to that. And Dugin ended up siding with the pro-Putin faction of his own party. And ever since then, Dugin's trajectory took a very, very wild path. For starters, his previous work on the not just on geopolitics but also on culture started being increasingly relevant. His academic career took off and became a pretty relevant philosophy professor at the Moscow State University. And over time, I mean, it's been 20 years since this guy has been writing and talking about stuff. Over time, his influence grew further and further. But one should focus, especially now in the current year, in 2019, one should focus a little bit less on the man himself and a little bit more on his ideas, because he himself downplayed and continues to downplay quite a lot his own popularity, because, well, for starters, because the rise to power of his ideas was a quid pro quo in a way. I mean, Putin adopted Dugin's ideas because they were useful, not necessarily because Putin liked Dugin necessarily.
Right.
And at some point, and it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly the moment, I suspect it's somewhere between 2009 and 2012, but somewhere in that period, Dugin himself started moving his ideas around a little bit in order to adapt to Putin and maintain some of his own influence as well. That's why it's more important to talk about Duginism as a set of ideas and a little bit less about the personality of Galievich Dugin.
I see. Okay. Well, in your video, Duginism and what it matters, you stated that he expands off of Saul Alinsky. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, he's at least at first. And nowadays, it was still the case in 2016 when I made that video called "What is Duginism and Why It Matters." It's slightly less the case now because, most of his ideas have already won the narrative. But at the time, it was still debatable whether his ideas will win the narrative. And as a result, he was applying quite a few of the rules, such as freeze your target, polarize it. That was one of the Alinsky rules that he was using quite often, by essentially isolating individuals that he deemed um, to be threatening to the progress of his own narrative. This has happened quite a lot, especially in countries where Duginism has been studied a bit more, such as Poland, such as Romania, such as Ukraine, to a lesser extent Brazil. But and that's why it's harder for us English speakers to know, because most of the research on this guy, it simply does not exist in English.
All right. So, what are some of his tactics? What does he usually do? Like, what is his? Well, how would we spot a Duginists? Like, what are certain telltale signs, like certain talking points, if you will?
Mm-hmm. Right. First of all, we have to remember that Duginism is, how our mutual friend Lloyd de Jong would put it, is a totalist ideology. So it's not like it has the mainstream press has recently caught up with right-wing deviationist Duginism. So, for instance, it's now even the New York Times can spot some of the Duginists on the right, but we have to remember there are Duginists on the left as well. One of the common threads is usually anti-Americanism. So, the more anti-American an individual is, the more likely that individual is a Duginist. The second one is usually a narrative that upholds some, under the guise of preserving indigenous traditions or something like that, upholds something that makes the whole situation closer to Russia rather than modernity. So, for instance, in Greece, you can see left-wing Duginists protecting, or defending, maybe I should say, defending traditional practices that are loosely associated with orthodoxy, but not really. And the reason they defend them is because those people end up voting for Duginist parties in Greece. So as a result, those who defend them, they basically grease the votes of those individuals in order to forward Russia's geopolitical goals. In the United States, I guess the most spectacular Duginist talking points are those that basically require the abolition of NATO, or even general. That's why there was a suspicion at some point that Trump might be a Duginist. He's not, but there was a reasonable suspicion at some point because he said, "Well, maybe I can have a decent relationship with Putin." Well, he doesn't, and because he can't. But those who resolutely support this kind of narrative, they tend to be Duginist most of the time.
Right. This may be an odd question, but my friend Artistic Layman, he has the Duginist flag. I guess it is. It's the Eurasian, the Neo-Eurasian flag. I guess it's like a 8-pointed arrow or star. I guess. Do you know anything about that particular symbol? Like,
No.
do you know much? No.
No, because I was never interested in symbolism.
Right.
That's one aspect. And second aspect is that that particular flag did not catch on. For instance, I would have been a little bit more interested if that particular flag had appeared more in public demonstrations that were obviously Duginist. I'm thinking here, for instance, at the Pegida, which is a very Duginist organization in Germany. Yet they don't. They sport a Russian flag at best, but they don't use the Eurasian
Right.
flag. It just did not catch on, and I'm not surprised it didn't. But yeah, and the main tactic of any Duginist operative, let's put it this way, is to identify a rift within the targeted society and then uh, expand it further in a way that at least presumably benefits Russia. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It's not perfect. Um, that's one of the things that makes Duginists dangerous, because they understand practical politics at a very deep level, and as a result, they admit that they sometimes can be wrong. some Duginist moves ended up being pretty terrible, in the sense that they weakened Russia's stronghold.
Yes. I guess my question is how much should we care about as Americans, as well as people who generally want to have world peace and have world stay relatively peaceful? How much should we care? How much
You're
this
breaking up
ideology?
really badly, man.
Oh,
Like
me?
really, really badly. How
Oh,
much
well,
should we care as Americans? And then I lost you from there.
oh, sorry. Uh, how much should we care about Duginism, and how much how much as Americans should we care? How much as NATO allies or
Yes.
Jesus? I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? I
Oh,
mean, it's oh God. This is what happens when we try to do a late night stream. Oh boy. Now better?
no.
No, better.
Now it's better.
Okay, cool. Um, so I guess how much of a threat is this guy to world peace? Not even world peace. That's a little term, but I guess this guy a big player, a major player, I could say, in this whole culture war. Because I know that a lot of characters such as Richard Spencer, Matthew Heimbach, have pushing Dugin talking points. Like, should the American people be of concern, or is this just some fringe faction group? What are your
Right.
thoughts?
Right. As I said at the beginning of this intervention, one should be less concerned of Dugin as an individual and a lot more about the set of ideas that are colloquially known as Duginism or Eurasianism or what have you. It's the same thing. Dugin personally may not be that particularly dangerous, but the set of ideas that he has been promoting are very dangerous, and in a way that maybe for now is not yet visible in the United States, but will probably soon be. But it's already visible in Europe. I mean, take for instance the case of France. In 2022, the French people will essentially have to make a choice between two essentially Duginist candidates. The final for the next presidential race will be between Marine Le Pen, who is, well, paid by Russia, and the Rassemblement National is essentially a Duginist party, and Emmanuel Macron, who already as president has the Duginist perspective on geopolitics. Just recently, Emmanuel Macron said that NATO is essentially dead and we should open up more talks with Russia because we don't want Europe to get further and further away from Russia, because it's very important to have an Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok, essentially. So
Right.
so that's why it's dangerous. I mean, the set of ideas is pretty dangerous. The Alexander Dugin himself may not be that dangerous anymore, but that's because he already won the narrative in very relevant corners of the Western world, essentially.
Right.
Kind of like in the same way that even though Marx had no influence in his life, his ideas have incredible influence today.
Yes. Yes, it is a fair comparison. Maybe Dugin eventually will not be as important as Karl Marx, but yes, it is in many ways an apt comparison.
My next question would be: you spoke before about this. You said that he says one thing in English and one thing in Russian. What would you say is the best source to actually view Dugin and his ideology, or rather his ideology, to get in its purest form? Oftentimes, what I do is I don't trust anything in English.
Subscribe to his YouTube channel when he speaks in Russian. Follow his streams. You subscribe to Russian language forums, and routinely has a lot of streams. And yeah, basically listen to the man in Russian.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's a good
Here's
start.
I think I gave the example right in the 2016 video from where this conversation probably starts, where he basically said that there has to be an ethnic cleansing of Ukraine, and everyone should just kill, kill, kill without. I think the exact quote is, "I'm saying this as as a professor, как профессор сказал." So I mean, that's something that you will never hear Dugin ever say in English. In English, he tries to present a more polished message, and he stays away from the ethnic cleansing kind of rhetoric. So that's one major example of the striking difference between what he promotes in English and what he promotes in Russian.
Right. So, and I guess the next question would be, how would someone go about, if let's suppose I'm in a debate with a Duginist, like with someone as a Duginist in the sense that they're someone who's a follower of his ideology, what would be the few talking points that I would use to combat his the worldview or his perspective?
Well, first of all, it is really important to figure out whether you're dealing with a Duginist who knows he's a Duginist, or a Duginist who just swallowed Duginist ideas without even knowing their source. It's really important, because the people who know and have willingly, ended up reading Dugin and ended up agreeing with the guy. For those kinds of people, I think the best book and the best kind of resource for that is Olavo de Carvalho's book, which is a debate in a way with Dugin. The two men never met each other; they just basically exchanged letters to each other, and ended up being a book. It's called "The United States and the New World Order," a debate between Olavo de Carvalho and Alexander Dugin. So if you're talking with someone who is unabashedly Duginist, knows exactly what he's talking about, has read the ideology, ended up internalizing it because he or she believed it's a good idea. That's how you deal with those people. You read some of the literature and you just attack them at the foundations of the ideology. If you're talking with people who just internalize Duginist ideas without even knowing that Dugin even exists, and there are a lot more of those than of the former, there are a lot more of the latter than of the former. With these kinds of people, you just ask questions, really. You make them think. That's what I found in my experience to work quite a lot. I just give data and ask questions. Why do you believe the things that you do believe? Have you ever been to Russia? If you haven't, did you know that, for instance, Russia has this particular economic data or this particular fact? It depends. For instance, if the argument is on tradition, you say, well, if Russia is so traditionalist, why does it have the highest abortion rate in Europe? By far, like very, very far. If Russian, for instance, this is an argument that is made routinely in right-wing circles, that, oh, you should get a Russian wife because Russian women are so traditionalist. Really, are they? They're not.
No, they're not. I mean, look at Instagram thoughts. Look at Instagram thoughts.
Yes, of course they're not. But that's the thing. I mean, you basically take it point by point, because people who have internalized Duginist ideas without knowing the coherence that makes these ideas flow into the public space to begin with, those people don't have an ideological commitment to those ideas. And as a result, you have to discover the thought process that they've been through and then try to refute that one to the best of your abilities at that particular moment. That's why I'm saying that, first of all, you have to assess whether you're talking with someone who is committed to the whole set of ideas and knows exactly what he's talking about, or just people who have just heard a very persuasive case somewhere on the internet and ended up internalizing a subset of ideas from the whole Dugin's package.
So my next question after that would be, I believe you stated in our discussion prior to this show that the translation of the Foundation of Geopolitics was done by NPI, the National Policy Institute. Is this true?
Yes. I mean, the best translation is not the only one, but the best translation that I was able to find was indeed done by Richard Spencer's think tank, which is terrible in a way, but not surprising, given that Richard Spencer's brand of so-called alt-right is essentially the closest you will be able to find in English of Duginist propaganda. So it's basically National Bolshevik. I mean, what is the alt-right? It's very, very left-wing type of economics, with a facet um, of well, of nationalism in a way, but not so much. And then you have um, full agreement on the whole identity politics. It's just that they think that the beneficiaries should be a different group of people rather than what the mainstream left thinks. So it's not really a surprise that they are the ones who provided most of the translations. Because keep in mind that the NPI didn't translate just the foundations of geopolitics. They also translated the fourth political theory, and they've translated some other less known works of Dugin as well. Yes.
Okay. I've heard that Richard Spencer's wife, his first wife, his ex-wife now,
It was
Nina
Becky, I think.
Nina Byzantina, I believe her name is.
Something like that. Yeah, she's Uzbeki, if I recall correctly, or something from the old Soviet Union.
Do you think that she may be a agent of Moscow, perhaps? And the reason I bring this, and it's kind of it's up to you if you want to answer this. You don't have to if you don't want to. The only reason I bring that up is because from what I've seen prior, when KGB infiltrators, they'd always come in either through Mexico or through Canada.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the lighter skinned, let's say, the more European looking agents always come in through Canada. Should Americans be more concerned about Canadians? Because I know there's a lot of Canadians and American relations and what have you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. I would not be entirely surprised if that particular Uzbek, I think she was Uzbek, yeah, might have at some point be in contact with Russian intelligence. I wouldn't be entirely surprised if that turned out to be true. But there is no solid evidence. In fact, there isn't even a reasonable assumption. Because if you look a little bit at Spencer's personality, just kind of does make sense that he would be hooked up with a mail order bride. I mean, I'm sorry, but it just kind of is. So you don't really have to work. You don't really have to head towards a Russian intelligence, FSB or KGB type of conspiracy to explain something that could be explained a little bit closer with human stupidity.
Exactly.
This to stupidity, exactly, yes, and that's why that's what I always strive to do, to try to head towards the explanation with stupidity first, and if the stupidity becomes too improbable, then I start asking other questions, like the Epstein case. In the Epstein case, the stupidity case just doesn't stand. But in this particular case, I think it does, to up to a certain point. As for the second part of your question on whether Americans should be more concerned about Canadians, I don't know. If we are to believe Yuri Bezmenov, there have been quite a few KGB infiltrators sent to Canada, and it is to be presumed that many of those now live in the United States. But whether this is still occurring today, I don't think so. I don't think so because there is no need anymore. There are a lot of mainstream, fully convinced pro-Russians in U.S. politics already. So there is not necessarily a need to send even further boots on the ground in intelligence terms. You can just feed those that already do exist. You just feed them the right narratives, and propaganda is a lot cheaper than sending boots on the ground.
Right. So I guess the next thing I want to get across is, do you think it would be beneficial? Because from what I beneficial to try to expose, the ideology itself and where it comes from to the multiple people, like let's say the ethno-nationalists from white nationalists in one room, the Pan-Africanists in another, and show them, like, let's say, just that they are regurgitating, Russian propaganda. Because to me, this type of information, this could unite the entire country if it's used in the right way. I mean, the left complains about the left in the United States, I should say, because again, that's another sophist term I've seen be used. In online discourse, we keep conflating right wing for like there's a universal right. and the
No, there
universal
isn't.
left. There
Yeah.
isn't, exactly. I agree.
Although increasingly your left starts to look more and more like our left, so there might be a unified left sometime in the future.
Yes. So, what I wanted to get across also is piggybacking off of that. Do you think it would be beneficial to expose, uh, to get two different groups of people, if possible, let's say a Pan-Africanist and a Pan-European nationalist in the same room, expose it to them? Do you think that would be beneficial to expose Russia?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, to be honest, not just myself, a lot of other people who have heard about this either from me or from other sources. I'm not the only one who's been speaking about Duginism. Have already tried that with with white nationalist type of groups, and it somehow worked. I mean, if you look, for instance, you go, what's that guy's name? Jared Taylor, I think. Yeah, the one who says white all the time. Yeah, Jared Taylor, right?
Cool.
Right. Who wait? Yeah. Okay, so that guy. If you look at and his organization is American Renaissance, correct? Just to make sure I don't get this wrong. If you look at American Renaissance discourse, let's say 2014 versus 2018 or 2019, their stance on Russia has shifted quite a lot to a more Russia skeptic at the very least. And you can even find articles that openly question Dugin personally and say that, look, there is a little bit, it's a bit more complicated than that. And I remember even reading once when I still cared about this particular subtopic. I remember even reading an article on their website saying essentially that, look, we don't really need academic gobbledygook from Dugin because it's not for us. So some sectors of the so-called white nationalist groups have already been convinced by this simply by the force of logic. And also, it also helps quite a lot when you start looking at with racists. Essentially, it's very easy to explain it to them once you look at the portions where Dugin talks about these things. And Dugin's position is indistinguishable from the far left, in the sense that he doesn't believe in racial solidarity of any kind, and in fact he has a very militant anti-white position himself. So it's very easy if you identify the correct quotes and you just give it to them. It's quite easy. With Pan-Africans, it helps, but I think it would help a lot more if such an expose would be combined with the history of Russian meddling and subversion in Africa. Let's not forget that the Soviet Union has had multiple complex operations in Africa. I'm reading right now a book written by a former intelligence officer during the apartheid period in South Africa called The Communistization of the African National Committee. And this whole thing goes back way to the late 50s. The subversion by the Soviet Union in Pan-Africanist movements, who did not, most of them did not start as communist movements, but ended up being communist movements. The ANC is the most spectacular example, but there are several others too, such as ZANU's, Mugabe's ZANU in what is modern day Zimbabwe. I've just been to Zimbabwe. I've seen the effects. It's terrible. Or the movement that ended up achieving the independence of modern day Angola. I mean, Angola still has the hammer and sickle on the flag, although the country is no longer communist. But the subversion by the Soviet Union in Africa goes a very long way back. So if one can do this expose by tying the present day situation with the history by Russia in Africa, maybe that will help, especially if you can exploit emotionally. And I know that sounds cynical, but that's the art of persuasion.
Right.
You asked me an honest question. I'll try to answer honestly, although I'm sure I'll be crucified for this, but who cares? So if you can exploit also their anti-colonialist feelings, basically paint Russia as an ideological colonizer. Because that's what it is. I mean, it's not like you would lie, but I'm saying that the order of things has to be in such a way in order to be
Right.
efficient.
Well, speaking of ideological colonizers and the fact that we're talking about the Soviet Union, I want to get a bit more and we're going to slowly go into a bit more tinfoil hat, and I want to say a bit more conspiratorial territory. You don't have to answer anything if you don't want to. Um, yes, there's a there's an individual KGB defector by the name of Sergei Tretyakov. Are you familiar with this man?
Tretyakov, yes.
Tretyakov,
Yes.
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 He stated in his, I believe, in many interviews that the Soviet Union never fell. Would you
Mhm.
stand by this statement?
That's a bit hyperbolic. No, the Soviet Union did fail. But yes, the set of ideas that were fermented into the intelligence of the Soviet Union, particularly the GRU, not necessarily the KGB, the GRU, those set of ideas did not die. And yes, some of them ended up being exploited further. Yes. But no, of course, the Soviet Union fell. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all of the ideas were defeated, because some of them were still not known because they were still being cooked at the time of the fall.
Right. So I guess the notion, I'll have to elaborate because that was kind of a bad question on my part, man. But I guess the argument he presents, the notion is that the enemy, not the potential enemy, but the enemy is still United States, NATO, and China for the Russian government.
To a certain extent, yes.
Right. In what extent do you see in that particular regard?
Well, this has something to do with what we call well, geopolitics in a way, but more in line of what history knows as eternal conflicts. Do you know what the eternal conflicts are?
I am not familiar with such a thing. No.
The notion of eternal conflict states that there are areas of the world who will always be in conflict, whether it's a cold conflict or a hot conflict, but there will always be a conflict because of their geographical positioning next to relevant forces. So, for instance, here are a few examples. The island of Gotland, that belongs to Sweden. But over time, it has always belonged either to Sweden or to Russia. And it has always been a conflict, a source of conflict. Even today, Russian submarines go very close to Gotland to see how the Swedish defense systems are still working or not in the current year. So because the geostrategic position of the island of Gotland is so relevant. Another example is the conflict between Athens, or maybe I should say Asia Minor, and Persia. Sure, when this eternal conflict was opened, there were a totally different set of geopolitical actors in that area. Today, there is no more Greater Greece. Asia Minor is basically the modern Turkish Republic, and the Persian Empire is the Islamic Republic of Iran. But the conflict is still there. The conflict between Asia Minor and Persia, whoever rules those lands, has to exist, and it still does exist today. So it's the same thing with the rivalry in a way between Russia and the West. I mean, Russia has been at odds with the rest of Europe, and by extension later on the United States as well. At the very least, since the 18th century. Let's put it that way. This is the 18th century, although it's been going on even further than that. If you look at the writings of the first Russian monks who wrote it was a proto-Russian in the 11th century. Even then, they were a bit bothered by the influence of the western part of Europe. So
Right.
this is not something new. So it is in a way an eternal conflict. So of course it's not something very spectacular to say, oh well, look, the Soviet Union may have fallen, but the enemy of Russia still remains the western part of Europe. Well, yeah, because it's an eternal conflict. With China is a bit more complicated. Yes, of course, China remains an enemy, but for different reasons. It's not necessarily for ideological reasons. I mean, with the western part of Europe, it has always been a difference between worldviews, and that's what fueled the difference. But with China, it's a more medieval way of looking at the world. on behalf of both of the parties. Because look, China, what does China want right now? Well, it wants cheap resources from Siberia. And as a result, the geopolitical entity called the People's Republic of China will try to achieve some of that. And one way to achieve that is to take a page from Russian activism and use it against Russia, like funding independence movements in Siberia. Because, from China's perspective, they don't want territorial expansion that much. And especially, they wouldn't want to have to administer Siberia themselves because that's complicated. And they already have a lot of their problems on their current territory. So, but, a puppet government in an independent Siberian republic, that would bode very well for China. On the other hand, of course, Russia, the rest of Russia, the western part of Russia, wants those resources for itself because it's on their territory. So what China does at this point is basically exacerbate the already existent break between the eastern part of Russia and the western part of Russia. Because if you have traveled in eastern Russia, you will see that the people there, yes, they all speak Russian, but they're not the same people. And Moscow has been abandoning them consistently, at least over the last 20 years, if not more. So as a result, China is trying to, exacerbate those differences already. Just exactly like Russia has been trying to do in eastern parts of Ukraine. I mean, geopolitical actors do this to each other all the time.
Right. Okay. Okay. I guess to try to elaborate what I meant about the Soviet Union not falling. Of course, it fell, but I mean, we see nowadays we still see
I can't hear you, man.
officials.
You're breaking up too badly.
Oh boy, my bad. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, terribly.
Better.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not getting very good connection on this end, but I mean, I think it's because we're so far apart, to be honest. Can you
I
hear me
have
now?
understood exactly nothing of what you said.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Better?
when you say one or two words, that's fine. But once you exceed 5 words, it gets really complicated.
Oh man, I'm sorry, man. Better?
No.
Oh shit. Fucking better?
No.
No. Oh boy. Sorry about this, man. Shit. I'm gonna drop out and jump back in. I will be right back.
This is one of the wonders of Romanian capitalism. We get 1,000 megabits per second for very cheaply. So yeah, rarely do I have these problems. I have many other problems, but this one in particular just doesn't exist on my end.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Nah, I'm
Sure.
sorry about. Is it better?
Yes, it is better. Yes.
Okay, thank God. Sorry about that. Yeah, it happens. It doesn't happen a lot. I'm sorry, but I think it has to do with connections between
Don't
various
worry.
people.
We all know that American connections are pretty terrible, especially next to the technology hub, which has a lot of technology but not much internet. I'm joking. Please go ahead.
Yeah, no, but what I was gonna say is that in places like Poland, they still have Soviet era judges, for instance.
Uh-huh.
I'm wondering to myself, do you think that there's some sort of like, living under the Soviet Union, living under communist rule? Do you think that there's some sort of, vendetta almost between Putin and the West? Like they've dedicated their almost 20 years of their life plus to trying to get back at the West. Do you think it's almost like a vendetta almost?
It's a bit more complicated than that. First of all, you have to understand the notion of post communism. This is something that many historians have failed to understand until very recently. Nowadays, the understanding of this starts to get a little bit better. I suspect it will get even better 30 years from now because usually the best history is written by people who haven't been through that event. Because the second or third generation can write, not necessarily unbiased, but not emotionally involved. So the notion of post-communism is basically that once you remove a communist regime, it takes a while, usually between 30 and 50 years, for the wounds created by that regime to heal. So if you go through what I like to call the intermarium, or the Central and Eastern Europe, except Russia, uh, you will see almost the same kind of problems, almost the same type of historical timeline, regardless of who was elected in power after the fall of the regime. I mean, for instance, in Poland, they had a much saner type of political power than we had in Romania. Yet the first 10 years are almost identical. Failed type of privatizations, a small oligarchy rising for a short little while, and then things slowly getting better and better to their present day when their things are pretty good. But this kind of thing is unavoidable. So as a result, you remain with and of course, even if you remove the dictator and the top tier elite of the party, that particular type of organization, the communist parties or the socialist or the labor parties, whatever they were called, they had 50 years to put their people in all facets of the state. And that it takes a while until you replace them all. Sure, eventually you do, because biology is unforgiving, but it takes a while. It really does take a while until you do that. So, and in Poland, there has been, this is indeed specific to Poland in a way that is not specific to the rest of the Intermarium. The way they organize their judicial system is very weird, in the sense that the judicial system is ruled by something that is now openly called, even by the supporters of it, it's called the corporation of the judges. That is to say, the politicians, the society through its representatives, has almost no say in how the judicial system is being run. This used to be the case in Romania too, but we did the reforms in 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, and things are now better. Not necessarily great, but definitely better. Now Poland is trying to do the same thing, but because in power there is a political party that is not particularly liked by Brussels, you get to read in the press an entirely different narrative, even though they're basically trying to do the same thing that we did 15 years ago. So that's one of, and of course there's also the fact that in Poland the regime did not fall, sorry, by a violent revolution like it did in Romania or in Albania. It fell through negotiations. There was the round table of discussions on how to transition from mental disorder to slightly less mental disorder. And the way the regime fell wrote the history slightly differently. Now, getting back to the present day, you have to remember that if the current ruling party in Poland, Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, the law and justice, if the current party had not been unabashedly anti-Russian, unabashedly pro-American, these are the two things that piss off Brussels the most. Because otherwise, if you look at their economic policies, very similar to either to Macron's or to Angela Merkel's, but maybe Angela Merkel's a bit more than Macron, actually. It's very left-wing economically. And, it's basically disliked because it's pro-tradition, it's a bit socially conservative, and because it's anti-Russian. Otherwise, it would be very liked in Brussels, which goes to show that the intentions in Brussels are very, very similar to the ones in Moscow. It's very interesting if you look at even further. The European Commission, which is the government of the European Union, has consistently been having in its ranks unabashed Maoists, former members of the Supreme Soviet. The second Barroso Commission had at least one member, which was a former member of the Supreme Soviet. So the things are not that different as they would seem. That's why there are a lot of individuals, well, some of them with a very kooky set of ideas, but they're still right when they say that, the European Union is more or less the Soviet Union with the capital in Brussels rather than Moscow.
Right. Okay. So continuing on, we're going to go a bit deeper into we're going to go eventually get to the deeper stuff in the conspiracy, because now at this point I've asked a lot about what are your thoughts on the whole Joe Biden Ukraine thing? Do you think that might be I guess a Russian, like, are we playing into the hands of Moscow? Or is this like a legitimate, like, we caught a black op and the one time America is lying or telling the truth and nobody believes them? I guess that's it's kind of a bit of a leading question. Just what are your thoughts on that?
I go quite often to Ukraine, so I'm probably an individual worth asking about that. Yeah, no. The thing is that the corruption by Hunter Biden, in particular, Joe Biden's son, is not news in Ukraine. This has been known for years. It's not something that emerged yesterday. I mean, the American press likes to pretend now that, oh my God, oh, we found this new scoop, this breaking news. No, it's not breaking news. This has been an open secret in the Ukrainian media for years, at the very least since 16, if not earlier. I mean, I've heard about it the first time in 15, I think. And it was from a mainstream source. I've heard rumors about it since 14. Although, admittedly, in 14 there were unconfirmed rumors, but then by 15 was a pretty confirmed thing. The fact that Hunter Biden has been engaged in corrupt activities in Ukraine, I don't think it's necessarily news. It's not the first time and nor the last time when uh, people very close to top tier officialdom in the US are engaged in shady activities in Eastern Europe. It's not the first time, and I suspect it won't be the last time.
Well, about that, the, do you think
You're
it's
breaking
an
up again
example?
terribly.
Remember back in the day when another channel I'm with, the Beckloff would go into robot mode, and this is a common
Mm-hmm.
All right.
occurrence.
Mm-hmm.
Do you hear me now,
No,
or
No, no,
no.
no.
let me join. I'll be right back.
Uh, oh, what a day for this to happen.
Ah, well, it happens. I mean,
I mean,
it's a good thing. It's a good thing that it works. I mean, I've once I had to cancel an entire stream because it wasn't working at all. So
yeah, it's like if
Better?
I want to argue like there's a massive conspiracy with Copa around the bend, but that's still too soon.
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised we haven't. I'm surprised we haven't been shut down by Copa or anybody. Can you hear me?
yes, now it's slightly better. Yes,
But that's
Okay.
for
I
the
guess you
children.
I guess you should have to get into this routine every 30 minutes. Just drop out.
Hey, that's fine by me, man. It's worth it staying up, God, all those hours of the morning. That's fine by me, man.
Okay.
You're the star of the show, man. But
Nah.
in all honesty, do you think that the whole corruption with Joe Biden is a result of nobody plays by the rules? Like we
Mm.
already know that there's like let's say the Soviet era judges were still in Poland. Is it possible that there are pro Russians being corrupt in Ukraine?
Oh yeah, sure, of course.
And the only way, and let me finish what I was gonna. Let me just finish because no one's playing by the rules. It's sort of a dog eat dog. Do a like black versus white, red versus blue, so to speak. And really, to beat the corrupt, you have to act corrupt. I guess if
Mm.
that makes any
Not
sense.
necessarily to act corrupt, but yes, this is a reasonable assumption to start from that nobody plays by the rules because nobody plays by the rules. I mean, it just is what it is. Americans, especially the American public, the American political class knows this very well, and Trump knows this very well. That's why Trump is the least bothered by this whole thing because he knows this, because he's been in this game for so long. I mean, he was a real estate developer. You can't be you have to at least act corrupt if you want to have success as a real estate developer. Last year, I've been to the United States and I've stayed a lot well, not a lot, about 2 weeks in Chicago with someone who is in the real estate business. And the stories that that man told me about the corruption in the cities left me astonished. I mean, in some respects, it's worse than Eastern Europe. So of course, Trump knows this very well and has a very good nose about. Well, this is probably a corrupt issue. This is probably corrupt. This is probably isn't. I trust his instinct because again, he's been in this business for so long that he's probably not wrong. Let's be put it this way. He'll probably be wrong at some point in time, but I don't think he's wrong on this one. So yes, and but the American public has been sheltered quite a lot from this whole reality for so long that it can't even conceive that. Well, in reality, in public, in practical politics, and especially at the top tier levels of politics in any country, there is not really that much of a observing of the rules. It's just the shape of corruption is different. The corruption in Ukraine is in one way, the corruption in Germany is in a different way, the one in the United States is in a totally different way. But corruption is something that is of a constant, especially when you have big government or a maximal state type of organization. So
Right.
yeah, that's why none of this surprises me in the least. Of course, of course there are corrupt officials, or were at the top level of the U.S. government. Of course, there are a lot of them at the top level of the Ukrainian administration. Yes, of course, it's not a surprise.
Right.
That reminds me of what Christopher Hitchens said about when Putin first came to power. Now we can get back to normal levels of corruption.
Yes, yes, yeah, that's true. It was true. I mean, the reason Putin was popular at first is precisely because he returned the situation to a level of corruption that the Russians were already accustomed with. Uh, that's it. And again, this predates communism. I mean, people don't realize that corruption in Russia is not something that emerged 50 years ago. It's something that emerged 300 years ago, at the very least. If you read Pushkin's story about Russian bureaucracy during the Tsarist time, it doesn't sound that different from the Leninist era or the Stalinist era or the Khrushchev era or the Gorbachev era.
Really
It's very similar.
interesting.
Yeah.
So going it well, speaking of Germany,
Mm.
do you think do you think that the whole Yellow Vest protest has Russian fingerprints on it? If that makes any sense. Reason
Uh,
I bring that up is because when I saw that the Germans were reacting to a petro tax
mhm,
created in France,
mhm.
I immediately thought, why are the Germans reacting to a policy pushed in France? Do you think that the Yelvis movement has been converged upon by the Russian interests?
The Yellow Vests started indeed as a protest against petrol taxes, but it quickly morphed into a general protest against the Macron administration. And mind you, those protests are still going on today. We don't call it a civil war because it's in France, but it hasn't stopped. They're still there. They're 1 year into the protests, essentially. I think last week they had the 1 year anniversary since they've been protesting. So yeah, uh, everyone, not just the Russians, everyone tried to seize a piece of the yellow vest narrative for themselves. You know, the conservatives tried it, the far left of France tried it, the far left from other countries tried it, the German Antifas tried it. Everyone tried to get a piece of the yellow vest narrative. So, and of course the Russians did, and not just the Russians. The Chinese interests also tried to get a slice of the yellow vest narrative. Why? Because it is such a huge protest, and it was largely uncoordinated, at least at first. Well, to a certain extent, it sort of still is. And it makes sense. I mean, if you want to forward some of your goals, you know, having a slice of a protest movement for yourself, that helps a lot.
Okay.
So, of course, some sections of the Yellow Vest are, whether willingly or unwillingly, sorry, aligned with some Russian interests. Now, with the question of yellow vests in Germany, that gets a little bit more complicated because Russia already has a very overt protest movement that it has in Germany. It's called the Pegida, the People Against the Islamization of the West. I think it's called the movement. Which at first when I said, "Yep, that's a Russian op," everyone's like, "Oh, come on! Not everything is a Russian op." And then they slowly came out of the closet and started waving Russian flags at their demonstrations. And sooner or later, everyone had to admit that, yeah, it kind of is. So I don't know. Maybe maybe those who decide these things in the Russian intelligence thought that Pegida is no longer efficient. I don't know. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there is some Russian interest in the yellow vests in Germany. In France, I think almost every stakeholder has a piece of the yellow vests. I would be surprised if that's not the case because I know even I suggested to conservative activists in France how to, hijack a portion of the narrative a little bit for themselves, essentially. I mean, everyone tried this, and I would be surprised if Russia did it, and I'm sure they did.
Right. The reason I brought that up was simply because I know about the what is it called? The Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And I knew
Mm-hmm.
that because I thought, hey, a petrol tax in France might affect or even, disincentivize, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline
Not
from opening.
necessarily.
Not
Not
necessarily.
necessarily. Yeah, with the Nord Stream, that Nord Stream 2 is where you see the Putinism or the Duginism of the German administration. That's how you pinpoint the pro-Russian leaning of the German administration. I don't know if you've seen on my channel, because that video, it still does it's rarely shared outside of well, circles in the know about this. But in the Ljubljana Three Seas Initiative Summit this year in June, the Secretary of State from Germany openly said that he doesn't want sanctions against Russia because that would infringe upon the German interests. And so, we've seen this movie before. The Russian resources and German manufacturing, that always spells trouble for the rest of Europe. And yes, the Nord Stream 2 is something that the German administration pushes the harshest. And what the administrations from the rest of the Three Seas Initiative, or the Intermarium, in particular Poland and the Baltic states, are pushing against, of course.
All right. Well, I guess we're going to start moving. A couple more questions, I guess, because we're going to keep going. We're slowly getting to the point where I was going to ask you like flat out conspiratorial stuff about Duginism, but it's interesting that Dugin would work with, let's say, certain Islamic groups, but also be anti-Islamic.
Mm.
Do you think that that's by design, simply because or not he, but the notion is to push anti-Americanism and destabilization everywhere? Do you
Mhm.
think he has a favoritism of, let's say, he likes Islam more than, let's say, communism, or communism more than Islam, or does he prefer one side or over the other?
I
You
don't
said,
think so. From what Dugin has written, basically anyone who pushes in, even if by proxy, in favor of the geopolitical worldview of Dugin, anyone who pushes in the same direction can be a fellow traveler. I mean, Dugin explicitly mentions, racist groups in the United States, like, he predicted Black Lives Matters, essentially. Yes, he says essentially that our operatives have to push to the formation of more and bigger and more violent Afro-American groups inside the United States. So yeah, and soon, before you knew it, Black Lives Matter. There you go. Um, as for the Islam point, one has to remember that Russia does not have an ideological tradition against Islam. It has a geopolitical one, of course, because they've struggled against the Islamic geopolitical interests, especially in the 19th century. But it doesn't have an ideological one. And just as recently as 3 years ago, Putin himself said that Russia will always be a friend of the Islamic world, and he's not wrong, because again, the Islamic world is a fellow traveler in the struggle against the West. And also the same goes with the presence of Islamists and Muslims in general in Russia. I mean, people forget that about a fifth of Moscow is very deeply devout practicing Muslims. If you look at the end of the Ramadan, the Bayram celebration, I forget the name in Arabic. Who cares? Have important streets in Moscow are blocked, essentially, because you have millions of Muslims
I've seen the
praying in the
videos.
streets.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. So that's why when I see Duginist talking points combined with anti-Islamic sentiment, I just laugh out loud, because I know that that doesn't come from a place of honesty, because the Russian narrative on Islam is very different from the narrative on Islam that we have in Romania, or that the Polish people have, or French, or even French people have. The traditional French narrative on Islam. The Russian narrative on Islam is very different, and more, what's the term, syncretic with Islam. I think it was also Putin who said basically that there's more in common. Russian Orthodoxy has more in common with Islam than it has with Roman Catholicism. That was a
Yeah.
political talking point as well. It wasn't a
Wow.
religious one.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, I can give you the article for that. I mean, it's in Russian, of course. It was never reported in English, but
Right.
uh,
Okay.
I wonder what other ideologies found themselves in simpatico with Islamic ideology.
Yeah.
sorry.
Go on.
I
It rhymes with Reich.
Yes, yes. A certain geopolitical entity that existed until 1945 was also very friendly with Islam. I was told that if you say it out loud, you might get your channel nuked. So I'm gonna be merciful of your channel.
Don't worry about it, man. I mean, honestly,
Yeah, that's the picture. There you go. Yeah, that's the picture. Yes, yes. And it's
yeah.
not the only one. There are a lot of um, um, military what's it called platoons praying to Allah whilst wearing a particular uniform of that particular geopolitical entity. Yes.
Well, the other thing I wanted to ask you is because, for what I hear from, because I've seen Dugin on Infowars, and
Hmm.
we're gonna, because I've heard arguments saying that Dugin is a Satanist, for what
Hmm.
have you. I've seen some evidence to suggest that he's more of a left wing occultist. If you know
Hmm.
anything about occultism, there's certain the left hand path and the right hand path that
Hmm.
exists. The
Hmm.
right hand path is you work with social norms, you try to serve the common good, and you work with God. It's very much Christian, and it's more akin to what Christianity would be, cultural Christianity, if you will.
Hmm.
And the left hand path is more about the ego, more about the self becoming God.
Hmm.
I only bring that up because if this is true about Duke, and which I'm pretty sure it is, you would think that Alex Jones would not have a guy like him on, especially if he knew about it without mentioning it. I
Hmm.
mean, I've seen Paul Joseph Watson basically give flat out lies
Hmm.
about Russia, as well as I mean, the articles that were posted on Infowars did not have any mention of Dugin being part of the National Bolshevik Party.
Of course. Of course. I don't know. I'll probably offend some of your fans by saying this, but you're crediting Alex Jones with too much intelligence. I mean, I'm sorry, but you do. Yeah, I'm not surprised at all. Infowars has always been a magnet for all sorts of fringe stuff, and you know, I think at this point everyone looks at them as entertainment. And yeah, of course, sometimes they get things right, but they get things wrong so often that looking at them as anything other than entertainment um, is a bit faulty for your own mental health, for starters, and generally for one's honest outlook at the world. There's that, and then there's also the fact that Infowars has always tried to be to have a lot of views and be popular, and sometimes compromises have to be made if you want to be popular. It
Right.
is it is the business it is. I mean, Infowars is a business, and that's okay. But one has to acknowledge that right from the get go before starting going, oh, but they've been inconsistent here and there. Of course, they were inconsistent.
Because one of the things I've done, and I actually tried to give Infowar when Owen Schroyer was at Berkeley, and I tried to give him your video about
Mm,
Duginism on a
mm,
USB drive at one
mm,
point,
mm,
to try to explain to him that you had a guy who was basically a left a spiritual leftist. I don't like using the term Satanist because I don't
mm,
have any evidence outside of Aleister Crowley
mhm,
connected to Dugan. Now,
mhm,
again, like I said, I personally don't think that it's a big deal, except when Dugan says, "I'm traditional, I'm traditional, I'm traditional,"
mm,
right?
mm,
Which again, Crowley was not traditional. He was very
mm,
much against Christianity. He was very
mhm,
much against, no social norms. I mean, the guy was a pedophile, gay
mhm.
guy essentially. And then the olden days, in the freaking 1800s, when that shit
Yes,
was forbidden practically.
yes.
Um, what would you say? What would I have to do to? Not what would I have to do, but what would you? What do you know about Dugin and Satanism? I guess.
Mm, mm. There is slim evidence on that. On one hand, we do know that around 2001, 2002, the Russian Orthodox Church essentially said that the church should stay away from that guy being Dugin, because the guy is a Satanist, and basically said that his ideas don't belong in the church because they're too pagan and the syncretism with too many pagan and neo-pagan set of ideas that are just unorthodox, both literally and figuratively. But that was 15, 16, 17, 18 years ago. In the meantime, a lot of the older clergy that understood this got, well, some of them retired, some of them got excommunicated. Some would say that Putin might have had something to do with that. The point is that today the Russian Orthodox Church no longer views Dugin as dimly as it used to. To the extent that sometimes Dugin is invited to the church's TV station to talk about stuff. So they still don't fully embrace him, but they definitely see him less dimly today than they used to. So there's that. Of course, there is a lot of work by Dugin on occultism, but I haven't read that much into that because quite frankly, I didn't care.
Yeah,
It's not my topic. I mean, I look at geopolitics a lot more than on this occultist
I
stuff.
dip into it when I see it. Oftentimes, like I have done a few videos on my own personal channel about the connections between white nationalism and LaVeyan Satanism, for instance, and how a lot of these white nationalists even today are basically LaVeyan Satanists or were at one point in their lives. And the reason I bring that up is simply because there are certain ideological talking points that are in both of them, and I think it's interesting. And sometimes you have to persuade people through rhetoric.
No, I agree. It is important. I just said that I don't care personally about it. But yes, and the reason I suspect this is the case, the common talking points between LaVeyan Satanism and white nationalism, is because both sets of ideas start from the rejection of modernity, essentially.
Right.
They're both not necessarily, well, maybe reactionary, but maybe reactionary, contrarian. They're both contrarian. They start from the rejection of modernity, a rejection of the present, rejection of the norms that led to this present. So, LaVeyan Satanism rejects Christianity at first, especially the norms of the churches, not necessarily God, but the norms of the churches, whereas white nationalism rejects what they think is the progressive narrative.
Right.
And just like with LaVeyan Satanism, the reason they're somewhat successful, although always marginal, but more successful than they should be, is because they start from a small kernel of truth. LaVeyan
Right.
Satanism says, look, the church is corrupt. Well, that's true. The church is corrupt. And and white nationalism starts from the premise that, look, anti-racism is code word for anti-white. Well, it kind of is. Not in the way that they describe it, but it kind of is. If you look at the policies that many universities apply to white people, it's very hard to avoid that conclusion. It's very hard to avoid it. Now, of course,
Right.
the way they frame it afterwards to construct their set of ideas, that's when they get into trouble, because it's kind of terrible. But they start from a kernel of truth, and that's why they're more successful than they should be.
Yes, one could argue that they're almost antinomian, in the sense that they
What?
are antinomian. Antinomian is a term used. It means against the law.
Yeah,
Against the
antinormian. Yes, yes, yes.
antinomian, antinorm. There you go. I guess it's kind of it's a good pun, I guess.
Mhm.
But what it is
Can you please
Christianity.
drop out? Can you please drop out and come back in again? You're into robot mode again.
Gotcha. Be right back.
But yeah, just
Oh, there you go. White fragility. Why it's so hard to write for white people to talk about racism?
I finally got through
I,
to reading it, and it's horrifyingly racist.
I didn't read this one in particular. Yeah, I'm gonna have to read this one too.
Robin DiAngelo always gives examples of talking to people and telling white people how they're part of a racist system, and for some reason she's shocked to find out that people don't want to be associated with racism.
Right.
Because
Right.
she interprets that as not being able to accept the racism that they're part of.
Wow.
Like
Who
this,
would have thought? You start accusing millions of people for being part of something they have no part of, and they're upset. Oh, who would have thought that? Okay, anyway, go ahead,
Any
please.
case, can you hear me now?
Yes,
yes.
much better.
Okay. Luke's a bit robotic. I think the robot
Yes.
went from me to him, but
Yeah.
uh,
You
I get
transmitted to him like a disease.
Uh-oh.
it did, yeah, yeah. I mean, the weakest link, right?
Yeah, there you go.
But what I was gonna say is, yeah, what antinomianism, and at least in Christianity, is you want to have Christ as your savior, but not as your Lord. You want to have the salvation, but not through necessarily acts, but through faith alone. But you don't actually do anything. Like you're like a recovering alcoholic, so to
Yeah,
speak.
you want the good stuff, but without the sacrifices implied by it. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
But what I was going to say, uh, I'll, uh, going into the Ukraine issue, there was a woman I noticed. Her name is Olenia Semeniaka. What are your thoughts on her? She a
Elena
Duganist?
Semeniaka? Never heard of.
Olenia Semeniaka. She's part of Azov.
Oh, part of the Azov propagandist. The Azov. I don't know about this particular individual, but the Azov propaganda machine has a very interesting story. For starters, I don't know if they still do it for English-speaking audiences. For local audiences, they still do. Their flag is basically the Antifa flag. It's red and black. The Azov collective, in a way, is something very interesting precisely because it was very useful at its time in 2014 in particular, but it has now gone out of control, and nobody knows how to put the genie back into the bottle because they're no longer needed, but they're still around and they refuse to go away. And yes, there have been attempts by Duginists to infiltrate them because why not? First of all, and some of them have been quite successful. I remember, for instance, in 2014, I think either 2014 or early 2015, when there was what's it called in English, conscription order, basically to conscript more people into the Ukrainian military to fight the war in eastern Ukraine. And some subsections of the Azov propaganda machine was basically arguing that, especially in areas of Ukraine that are not majority Ukrainian or are just 60% Ukrainian, they were basically arguing that it's their war and not ours, as in the minority community, and basically sabotaging the efforts of the military to get more people in it. It's a very interesting story, but it's worth studying while you're in Ukraine. I tried doing that, but other priorities came on top, and eventually I didn't study as much as I would have wanted. But it's very interesting to study from the country itself. It's very hard to study it from the internet because most of their materials are either outdated or even outright false. I mean, I've noticed cases of material that was allegedly coming from them, but in fact it wasn't, and it's very hard to identify the source. They've been subjected to a lot of black propaganda as well.
Yeah. Could you go over like how did they start? Who started them? Is it possible, like just really quick, or is that like another individual entirely?
Too complicated. Officially, there is a founder, but that particular guy. I studied this in 2015 a little bit, but the official founder actually joined about 5 months after after it was founded. It was basically the harshest. The harshest factions of the Maidan protests that started it. And of course, they weren't particularly coherent, so that's why the official founder, which again joined months later on, this guy at least was coherent, and that's why gave coherence to the group.
Right.
But it's basically the harshest factions of the Maidan Niezalezhnost protests in January 2014, if I recall correctly. Anyway, the Maidan protests that ousted Yanukovych eventually.
Okay. 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 Well, other than that, I think I'm pretty much done with questions at this point.